This video is a recording of how to work on the worksheet 8 for SGD113. We're going to start working on the while loops for this worksheet. Let's get started with the first question, where we are asked to declare a Boolean variable using the keyword bool for declaring that data type, giving it a name. Is looping would be a good name for it, and setting it to true. Next step that we're required to complete is to declare a while loop, or define a while loop that will be based on that Boolean for condition. So we are going to use is looping here as our condition. I do not need to specify that it is equal to true, because it's already a Boolean, and a condition needs to be evaluated to a Boolean, whether it's true or false. Inside of the while loop, we're required to change the question 1 text and provide the definition of an infinite loop. An infinite loop basically is a loop that runs forever. Which is will freeze Unity completely and will require for you to restart the application. So once we've written out that text, right now in the way that we have declared our while loop, we have an infinite loop, since there is nothing within the body of the while loop that is actually changing the value of our Boolean is looping. So we need to make sure we set is looping to false, so that we actually break out of that while loop. Let's save our script and test the code inside of Unity. You can make sure just for a minute that question 1 is still connected to the on-click event of the question 1 button. And when I test it, the text that I entered previously in the Visual Studio is actually displaying here in the user interface. Next, we're going to work on the next question, where we're required to declare 2 integer variables. One is name counter, and we initialize it to 0, and the other one is another integer that we set to 0 as well. The next is to create a while loop. That while loop is based on the value of the counter. So basically our while loop needs to run from all values between 0 and 100. So while the counter is less than or equal to 100, because 100 needs to be included, in here I need to complete certain code. So the first very thing that I need to do is make sure that I change the value of the counter, so that eventually I will break out of the loop. I like to set up this kind of code immediately, especially for a newer programmer. And you make sure you don't forget that little step. That's quite important. Before I move on here, I need to figure out what it is that I need to do with the sum. So my counter is going to be the value that will be first set to 0 and then be incremented to 1, 2, 3, etc., all the way to 100. So I can use that counter here to keep incrementing the sum, which is supposed to be the sum of all those numbers. So I can do here sum plus equal to increment it, and then add the counter to it. All right, so that should be all that we need here inside of the while loop. After the while loop, we need to update the question 2 text to the sum. And because sum is an integer, to display it in the text, we need to convert that into a string. So we can save this and try out the code for question 2. And then click to make sure that question 2 was still connected here. And 5050 is the expected result here for the sum of all integers between 0 and 100. If you are not sure whether you've included all of the correct values with the counter, you could always put a little debug statement here that will print the value of the counter. And this way you can avoid off by 1 type logic errors or semantic errors by printing all of your counters in the console here. If I were to test this out again in Unity and press play and click on question 2 here, I can see in my console that the very first value for the counter, the one that's added to the sum, is going to be 0. And the very last one, if I scroll down to the last statement in the console, is including 100. So I make sure that way that I've included all the values that were required for that loop. Once I've done and I'm certain that a counter is taking the correct values, I can just comment out the debug statement. For question 3, we're required to declare 2 integer variables. The first one is the counter again, but this time we initialize it to 5. If I had my number, that would work out a little bit better. And then the second one is the product. And obviously, because we're dealing with the multiplication, we do not want to initialize it to 0. Otherwise, all multiplications would result in 0. So we initialize the product to 1. The next step is going to be declaring a while loop using that counter variable to set up our condition. We want to make sure that the counter goes all the way down to 0. However, we do not want to include 0, as of course that would kind of destroy the value of our product back down to 0. So let's have our counter variable here, and let's set it to greater than 0 for now, and then we'll identify if we are taking into consideration all of the values for the counter as required per the question there. So there is my statement, and again, because I am creating a while loop, I want to make sure there's something inside of my code that will make me break out of that loop. And so if I take my counter and decrement it for each iteration, eventually my value will be less than or equal to 0, and I will break out of the loop then. Now we want to figure out the product of all those numbers. Counter here, if we're looking at it at the beginning, will have a value of 5. We decremented to 4. Then 4 is still greater than 0. We're going to keep going till the value 1. 1 is going to be decremented to 0. And then that will allow us to break out of the loop. So technically, we are including all of the values when we're trying to break down the logic of the while loop. But let's just make sure of it. So first of all, let's set up the product to be equal to itself times the counter. And then right before that, to make sure that we're including all of the values, we can put a little statement here that will help us visualize what the value of our counter is. All right. So at the end of my while loop, once I break out of the loop, I want to print the value of the product in question 3 text. So be careful here not to pick up the wrong text. We need to work on question 3 text. And here I just need to display the product. All right, once this is done, we can actually test out our while loop and see the outcome in the console and in the user interface. So I can see the value 120, which seems relatively reasonable. When I look in the console here, the first value for counter is 5, then 4, 3, 2, 1, and then it ends at 1. If you ended up having the value of 0 here, that means you had one additional iteration. So you need to make sure you've set up your condition correctly here by setting the counter had to be greater than 0 but could not be equal. That's it for question 3. Let's move on to question 4. I believe now we're going to start working with conditions as well as while loops. So let's set up our different integer variables here. We have 2 of them. One is the counter, and we can set it to 1 to get started. Then we have a number of loop here. and I believe we're required to set it to 0. And then we need to create a while loop. In the condition, we're supposed to use the counter. And make sure that the counter is less than or equal to 100. Kind of track of the value that we were supposed to set up for the counter there. All right, so so far so good. Now we are needing to have some if and else if statements to check if the counter is even or divisible by 5. So one of the operators that's really useful when we are trying to figure out if a number is divisible by another is the modulus operator, which looks like the percent symbol. So let's check out if the counter is, for example, divisible by 2. The modulus operator here is actually returning the remainder of the division. And so if that remainder is 0, that means that the counter is actually divisible by 2. And if that is the case, we are told that we need to raise the counter by 3. Our next case now is going to be checking if the number's counter is divisible by 5. So we're going to use that modulus operator again, and we're going to check if it returns a remainder of 0. If that is the case, that means our counter is actually divisible by 5, and in that case, we need to raise the counter by 2. There we have it. And then the last case, so if the number is not divisible by 2 and it is not divisible by 5, in that case, we need to raise the counter just by 1. Well, I can just use the plus here. That works out the same way. So let's take a look at the instructions for just a second. It tells us that if we encounter a number that is both divisible by 2 and by 5, so let's say maybe 10, then it should be raised by 3 and stop then. So the way we have set up our code here is going to work. Let's say I come in here into checking the first condition. Note that I have used if, and else statements. And so when I come up and check the first condition with the number 10, for example, 10 is divisible by 2, so my counter will be incremented. And because the first condition was true, and I use a series of if, else statements, then I will break out of this entire block of code here and come into after those statements right there, still within my while loop, but out of the if and else if statements. So we have already satisfied this condition here that requires that if the number is divisible by both 2 and 5, we raise the counter by 3 only, which is exactly what's happening. So anytime we go through the loop, we need to raise the number of loops by 1. So ideally, we're going to put the number of loops here. We're going to increment that over here. Because it needs to be incremented by 1 regardless of the divisibility of the counter. So outside of those if and else if statements, I can use the number of loops. I'm still inside of the while loop here, so it will be updated for every time the loop iterate. So in the end, when the loop has finished, we need to print that number of loops in the question text. So I need to make sure I'm outside of the while loop. A little note here you may not have noticed, but if I place my cursor right before an opening curly brace, it will highlight the second and matching curly brace. That can be useful if you have some issues mismatching your curly braces. That could be one quick way to kind of figure out which one is missing there. So last statement here in that question, which I believe was the question 4. Or was it? Let me double check. Yes. Question 4 text.text, and we're going to set that to the number of loops as required. There we go. Let's save this and test out our code and make sure it works. We can go to Unity. It'll take a second for everything to be updated. I can press on the play button, and when I click on question 4, my answer is 50, which is kind of a reasonable number to obtain here for this question. Let's move on to question 5, where we're going to use a do-while loop. Now, do-while loops are a little bit different than while loops. They're working in a similar fashion to a certain extent. They allow us to repeat a block of code till a certain condition is no longer true. But the condition is checked after the loop body has been executed and not before. So sometimes that can become kind of a useful thing to have if you need the code to be executed at least once before you check on the condition. So let's declare our Boolean variable here. We're going to use our friend is looping here. Because I'm in a different function, then it won't interfere because of the scope. And this time I'm setting it to false, so then I can use my do while loop. The statements are just slightly different. We start with the keyword do, open and close our curly braces, and right after the curly braces we can have the while statement. And inside we need to have our condition. So we are going to use is looping here. And one little particular thing not to forget is after that while and the condition, we need to make sure we use the semicolon here to end the block of code. So inside our block of code here for the body of the loop, we are going to change the question 5 text. And we are required to tell the minimum amount of times the do-while loop executes. So I can write this already. A do-while loop executes at least once. So here in our example, is looping is false. If we were using such a variable with a while loop, the body of the loop would never be executed. But because we are using a do-while loop and the condition is checked after the body of code has been executed, then we end up having at least one run and we don't need to change the value of is looping in that case. So let's take a look at what happens in the Unity when we run question 5. There it goes. I get the text displayed in the user interface, and I am not in an infinite loop, obviously. I still have control of Unity. All right, let's work now on question 6, where we are to declare 2 integer variables. One is the sum that we need to set to 0, and the other one is the counter that we need to set to 0 as well. We're going to use a do-while loop once again. This time we are going to use the counter as a condition, and the counter needs to be less than or equal to 50. And we're going to check our extremity cases here to make sure that everything is as it needs to be. All the correct values are incremented as needed. So first, let's calculate the sum. The sum is calculated by adding the counter onto it. And then we can make sure that we increment the counter so that we don't get an infinite loop. And then before that, just to be on the safe side, we can use a debug statement to print the value of our counter and make sure that we're including 0 and 50. So if I look at the way my do-while loop is set up, the counter is going to be set to 0. That'll be my first value. 0 will be added to the sum. Then I'll move on to 1. 1 is less than or equal to 50, and I keep on looping. Let's say we get to 49. Counter is 49. We add that to the sum. We increment the counter to 50. 50 is less than or equal to 50. Therefore, we loop again. We'll print the counter 50 here. We increment the sum by 50, which is what we want. And now the counter becomes 51. And then at the end, I check if 51 is less than or equal to 50. It's not the case. Therefore, I break out of the loop. So it seems like we've set up our while loop or do while loop correctly. All we need to do is update the question 6 text to provide the sum. There it goes. Let's save our worksheet and let's test it out inside of the console here. move on to question 6. I get 1,275 as a result. And if I look in the console, my first value for the counter that's included in the sum is 0. And the last one is set to 50. So I've included all the values that were required there for this purpose. Question 7, we're going to work back on to the product. This time we're declaring a counter and initializing it to 6. And we're going to also declare the product and initialize that to 1. All right, the next step is going to be declaring a do while loop. I'm going to set up the condition here where we need to have the counter greater than 0. We don't want to include the 0 in this do while loop. We'll check to make sure we have everything that needs to be included there. So inside of the body of the loop, I need to first modify my product by multiplying it by the current value of the counter. The next step is I need to make sure I decrement the counter. And I could have, just as I did previously, I could have a debug.log statement to display my counter and to make sure that I don't have any values, undesirable values. But if I think about it, the counter is going to be 6 initially. 6 is going to be multiplied to the original product, which is 1. And then I decrement the counter to 5. 5 is greater than 0. I keep going. Let's say the counter is now 1. 1 is greater than 0. I keep going. 1 is multiplied to the current product and stored back into the product. Then I go down to 0. And then when I check the condition, 0 is not greater than 0. So I break out of the loop. I think all the values are included as needed. Let's update the question 7 text to display the product. There we have it. Let's test this out. So I'm moving to Unity and testing out question 7. And I can see the value displayed in the user interface is 720. I do start at 6 and I go all the way down to 1, which is what was required for that do while loop there. Finally, we're moving on to question 8, where we're actually going to create 2 nested while loops. We're going to follow the directions originally, and then I'll talk a little bit about how those operate. So we are declaring 3 integer variables. There is first loop, and we set that to 0. There is second loop, and we set that to 0 as well. And finally, there's the counter, and we set that to 0. So here we're going to do a while loop inside of the while loop. And basically the idea is that the main or the initial while loop is going to run. And every time we get into the inner while loop, the one that's located inside the other one, it's going to execute every time. So it's relatively easy to set up. The first condition is to work with first loop. And first loop needs to include 10. So we want to make sure that first loop is less than or equal to 10. It'll go from 0 into that value here. Let me put a little bit of space between the variable declarations and my while loops. Inside of the first while loop, there's a second while loop. And this time I'm going to check that second loop is less than or equal to 10 as well. So now inside of the second loop, the one that's the inner loop, we'll call it, we need to make sure that first we increment the counter and also the second loop variable. Outside of my loop here, I need to make sure that I increment the first loop as well. once I've prepared all of my while loops there, at the end, I'm going to update the question 8 text to display the final counter number. So what's going to happen here, and I forgot one of the critical elements here. If I were to do this, first loop is going to start first with the value 0. So 0 is less than or equal to 10, and then I'll come straight into this loop here. The second loop is going to have the value 0 originally. 0 is less than 10, so the counter will be incremented, and second loop will be incremented. I'm staying within the body of this loop here up until second loop gets to the value 11. So now 11 is no longer less than or equal to 10. So I break out of this loop, and then I increment first loop to 1. So my second loop will be 11, and my first loop will be 1. And then if I iterate again, first loop 1 will be still less than or equal to 10. But when I come here, second loop is 11. I'm not even going to execute that loop, which is not what I want. I want to be able, for each values of first loop, I want to repeat the whole loop here with all values from 1 to 10, from 0 to 10. So I need to make sure here that once I get out of the while loop, the inner while loop, I reset the second loop to 0. That's actually a critical component of using these nested while loops there. Let's move back to Unity and try out our nested while loop with question number 8. And I get the value 121. So it makes sense because we're having first loop going from the value 0 all the way to 10, which is 11 iterations, and then second loop follows the same pattern from 0 to 10, which is 11 iteration, and 11 times 11 is 121. This confirms our result there. This concludes worksheet 8. I hope you enjoyed, and see you next time.